what is a surname project? I suppose we use the surname projects to bring together surname research, as Pat was saying, along with historical sources, and then adding in the Y-DNA to really get a true understanding of our ancestors and how they came together and where they came from as well. I suppose there's three different types of surname projects. There's individual surname projects, which just focus on an individual surname, be it Costello or Murphy or Brennan or whatever it may be. We then have geographic surname projects, which the Kilkenny Surnames Project is one of them. And then we have, obviously, that will focus on all surnames that are found in that area, and it looks at them all and tries to help all those different people and surnames, which is quite a task, let me tell you. So we concentrate on kind of small bites at a time. And then the last would be maybe a clan or a tribe, where there's many surnames associated with an old clan or a tribe, and we try and focus on those surnames and see, can we, using historical sources, surnames and the DNA, can we identify that clan or tribe? These projects are all hosted on a website called Family Tree DNA, and it's the same company that you would actually do the testing on, Family Tree DNA. The testing, there's several different levels, but I can go through that in the questions if anyone wants to know. But basically, you do your test, and really the Family Tree DNA just give you your results, and the rest of it's up to you. You have to go off and do the research. You have to look for all the historical sources, and you have to really figure it out yourself. You have to try and understand the Y-DNA. The good news is that there's a great community online, in particular, that are incredibly helpful in trying to help anyone understand their DNA, and they'll also help you with historical sources and all the rest. And there's a myriad of different sources and Facebook pages and all sorts of things, and the actual projects themselves that will help you find the resources that you need to really understand your DNA. And the projects themselves are actually run by volunteer administrators, no money involved, unfortunately. So I run a couple of projects. I run the Costello Surname Project, along with a few others, and I run the Kilkenny Surnames Project, again, with a few other volunteers. I'm involved in a few other projects as well, but they're not really relevant to what I'm talking about. So the surname projects are particularly useful for Irish people, and I suppose one of the biggest issues we have with the surname projects is actually that not enough Irish people are doing these DNA tests, and if they did, it would actually enhance this even further. But the Irish surnames are actually some of the oldest in the world. A lot of Irish surnames are 1,000 to 1,100 years old, and so it gives us huge depth to actually be able to use the DNA to try and make these connections. So with the surname project, what we try and do then is try and, if we're say looking at Murphy, for instance, is there just a single founder of the Murphy surname, or is there multiple founders of that surname when the surname era started 1,000 years ago? And so that's the kind of the very basic aim of most surname projects. I don't think I've actually seen a surname project yet that actually only has one single ancestor. Almost all of them have multiple ancestors. And it's not something that people go into this kind of testing often think about. You think, maybe read about your surname, and there might be a particular kind of history for that surname, this noble family or whatever it may be that the surname is derived from, and you go, well, I must be descended from them somewhere along the line, but actually we found in most testing that that's actually not the case. But those prominent families, using the annals and lineages put together by the likes of O'Hart and Wolfe, McFurbish, Carrigan in the Ossory case, Shearman, and all these guys, they put together lineages of these prominent families, that are supposed to go right back into history. So we take those lineages and then see where does the testing fit with those lineages. We also look at surname relationships, like I mentioned. So in the case below, there's the Dalcosh, who are from Thomond, and Brian Boru would be a descendant of the Dalcosh. And the Dalcosh is a particularly well-known case in the DNA world, where they have identified the line of Brian Boru, one of his O'Brien descendants. This is the Lord of Inchiquin, has done his DNA test, and he matches all the other O'Briens, not all the other O'Briens, but lots of other O'Briens in the right sort of area. He's a 33 line descendant of Brian Boru. And what the thing is with the Dalcosh, there's actually, if we look through those lineages and those annals, we actually see that there's lots of other surnames associated with the Dalcosh. Things like McMahon, Hogan. There's umpteen surnames that are associated with them, and they're supposed to branch off at certain points from the O'Brien surname or before. And that Dalcosh project identified one specific DNA marker and all the markers below it. And what they found is that the surnames, basically, they all branch off in the right location. So if you do your DNA test and you end up actually with what's called a haplogroup, which I'll explain in a minute, which starts with DC, it actually stands for Dalcosh. So it's quite well known in the DNA world. So you can actually prove that you're descended from those Dalcosh from Thomond. There's also the O'Neills, like another. There's another marker, DNA marker that's associated with them. And again, that's proven as well. So the biggest thing to be aware of is usually 50% of men will actually not have the surname they expect when they look at their matches. So let's say, for instance, your name has your match, and 50% of men will find that there's actually not many Murphys in their matches, if any at all, and there might be a lot of Carrolls, for instance. And so in that case, we use either term, either NPE or SDS, which stands for non-paternal event, or surname or DNA switch. And I suppose what most people think of when they hear the non-paternal event would be that it's perhaps an infidelity somewhere along the line in the last 1,000 years has led to this surname being switched. But actually, in the Irish context, it seems to be that there are actually many more reasons, and actually many more reasons. The other reasons are far more common than actually the infidelity. Things like adoption is quite common under Brehon law. We also have quite a notable case actually with Dalcosh, which is actually proven with paperwork, where an O'Brien man, who obviously wasn't terribly prominent in the O'Brien lineage, married a butler woman, and that butler woman had no other brothers, so her butler name was going to die with her and her sisters. And so her father insisted that the O'Brien man take the butler surname. So now in the Dalcosh project, there's actually a group of butlers which is completely normal in the surname, but they're actually really O'Briens. But for hundreds of years, I think it was about 1560s, this married the clan territories in some of these surname projects where these surnames would have originated. So we have the likes of Thomond, which the Dalcosh has been well proven and documented. And like I say, we're currently trying to do something similar with the Ossory area. I suppose just the last point there is, we use the Y-DNA tree, the most distant known ancestor of the testers, and the geography that the area that ancestor was from. We compare that to the historical lineage and see if we match. And if we don't, then we actually have to go off and do research and figure out where that different group of whatever surname it might be from, and how they manage to also get the surname. I'm just going to quickly run through the different types of DNA, and won't labor this too much, but just to make you aware, there are 3 different types of DNA which can be tested for. So there's autosomal DNA, which really only allows you to find people that you're related to that have tested in the last maybe 250 years. Normally, most people would have seen the ads for the likes of Ancestry, MyHeritage, and these companies on the TV. And so that's the test that you're going to do. So it's called an autosomal DNA test. The test that I'm mainly talking about tonight is what's called Y-DNA. It's a much different kind of test. It only looks at your paternal line. And it goes back about 200,000 years, and the main company is, as I say, Family Tree DNA. And so if you look at the diagram below, you'll see that the nucleus contains the autosomes, which are your first 22 pairs of chromosomes. And so that's what you're getting the results for when you do your autosomal test with Ancestry and MyHeritage and all of those companies. The Y chromosome, as you can see, is right down the bottom there, the little blue one. So if you're a man, you have an X and a Y, and if you're a woman, you have two X's, so one X from your mother and one from your father. So the Y chromosome is quite unusual. The autosomes, you basically get a complete mishmash. You get 50% from your father and 50% from your mother, but it's a complete mix. It's random. So you can, the DNA ends up getting very mixed and jumbled. That doesn't happen with the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome is passed directly from father to son and almost completely unchanged. And that's the reason why we can actually go back this 200,000 years. The other type of DNA is called mitochondrial DNA, which is actually shared on the maternal line. And again, it also goes back about 200,000 years. And the Family Tree DNA are the main company that have tests for that. This is just a quick diagram just to give you an idea and really drive home the differences between the types of DNA. So all these ancestors on the top row would be your direct great-grandparents, so 64 people there, 32 couples. And in essence, if you do an autosomal DNA test, you're going to find anybody who's also descended from or far more into it anyway. And so even though women don't have the Y-DNA, it doesn't preclude them from doing the research. So when you do your DNA test, the main thing that we want to get out of the Y-DNA test is that you're given a haplogroup. And so a haplogroup is a group of people that you share the common DNA marker with. And so it's really how we construct the tree by seeing which group you fall into and which groups you don't fall into. What sets you apart or what you have in common with the other testers. And using that, then it allows us to group the different people in the projects into different groups, but no matter what their surname, if they have the same haplogroup, then they're closely related. We can tell how closely related they are. So this is just to give you an idea of the kind of thing you can find using Y-DNA. So this is actually my own haplogroup in the heart of the R1b. Now I'm on a branch way down the line from R1b, but this is the kind of route that you take out of Africa. So you start off with the A haplogroup in Africa, which is about 200,000 years old. You then have 70,000 years before that branches off and becomes the B. Then you have things like the C haplogroup, which actually ended up migrating all the way over to the USA and Central America and South America. But you see, the next haplogroup I have here is F. So obviously we're missing D and E. So I think D went to India, E goes up to North Africa and around the Mediterranean. So this is, the D's and E's would have branched off at this point here. And so this is kind of time frames for these as well, for these branching points. And so my ancestors would have taken this line over, taken this route over, as you can see, hundreds of thousands of years, and eventually about 28 or 25 to 28,000 years ago, they were up on the Russian steppes. Thing is, most people's ancestors at this time, and even a lot more recently, would have still been either black or very dark brown. And it's actually the first people with white pigment in their skin, actually found in ancient DNA skeleton in Poland, which are around 67,000 years old. So up to that, it's reckoned that most people were actually dark-skinned. So this R1 haplogroup splits into two branches, the R1b, which is the one that we're probably talking a fair bit about tonight, and this other R1a, which actually ends up in Scandinavia. As I say, there's lots of other branches. You can actually see them down the bottom here. These are the major haplogroups, A to T. And as I say, my haplogroup is R. There will be a reference on a few of the other haplogroups tonight. But this is probably the hardest bit to wrap your head around, is these haplogroups. Unfortunately, it's not too easy to explain without sitting down with somebody for quite a while. I suppose this is just another view. If you imagine this was all the men that have ever lived, if we have A here at the top, this branch here would be the A branch, which stayed in Africa and branched off into other sub-branches of A. So this might be A1 and A2, this then becomes A1 and whatever, and it keeps branching off and keeps going down and down and down. Back up here, the A branch would have a branch coming off here, which would be B, and then this grayed outline here might be the B branch that comes off and branches off and branches off. You then have C comes in here, D comes in there, and so you get my meaning that basically this will create huge amount of branches. There's about 200,000 branches so far have been found on the haplo tree, which is a huge number. And so when you get down to this level down here, down to more modern times, you have a massive amount of branches to look at. And so one of the things that's helping us actually date these branches and the location of them is actually what's called ancient DNA samples. And ancient DNA samples, as you see there, are from archaeological digs. Pretty much any person that isn't alive, if their DNA is sequenced, it's considered an ancient DNA sample. And so what we actually find is that if we have an archaeological context with dating and also with carbon dating and the location, we know where that person was roughly at, what kind of time period they were there, and then if we are able to do the DNA sequencing on that, then we can actually pin that haplogroup, that branch of the haplo tree. We can place it in that particular location, be it Ireland or wherever in the world it is, at a particular time. And so then that allows us to judge the more recent, the people who are alive, allows us to judge their haplogroups, and are they miles and miles and miles away, are they very close? In fact, there was a recent study there, you might have seen some of there's a program on RTE by Dr. Lara Cassidy in Trinity, where she sequenced 150 Irish skeletons, and one of them was actually in Sligo, and one of the bodies, the skeletons that she sequenced, which was said was from Sligo, and they found the haplogroup. And actually, in one of the projects that I'm a member of, don't run it, but they actually found that some of the two of the participants were literally, they were from 5 miles away from where that haplogroup was, where that skeleton was found. These people still living in the same area 4,000 years later, only 5 miles away, the exact same, or actually sub-branch of that same haplogroup. So they're descended from the same people, which is pretty amazing.
Sorry about that.
No problem at all. So this is just to give you an idea, this is actually a sub-branch of the R1b that I'm a member of. No, I'm not actually on this branch here, but just to give you an idea of the complexity of the branches. There's tens, hundreds of branches even below each of these boxes. So there's a huge amount of branches branching off from just the one location. And this occurs all over the haplo tree. So it can be quite confusing, but once you get your teeth into it and you get your head around it, it's all actually quite magical. And it's going to go into any of the details and any of that stuff that I mean, it's very correct. So this is the haplogroup, haplogroups of modern Irish men. So the I haplogroup is about 12% of the modern Irish men, and the I haplogroup split into two very quickly, which are I1 and I2, and the I2 are actually the first haplogroup to come to Ireland in the Mesolithic, but they would have actually been the dominant people that were here during the Neolithic also. And we then also have the I1, which were very likely much later invaders, and probably Anglo-Saxon, Viking, or Norman, as a lot of the I1 men actually have those Anglo-Saxon, Viking, or Norman surnames. We then also have 1% of the G haplogroup, which would have come from around modern day Turkey, would have brought the early farming methods to Ireland probably 7,000 to 6,000 years ago. And then we have this major group here, which we've already talked about a bit, was the R1B. So 81% of Irish men tested are descended from R1B. And so this was a huge Bronze Age influx of men and displaced most of the I and G haplogroups that were actually already in Ireland. And 6% of these guys came back in. So there's at most 7% of the population are descended from the original Bronze Age invaders, or sorry, the Mesolithic and Neolithic peoples on their male line. Actually, on the magical line, it's very more likely to actually hold descended from these Mesolithic and Neolithic of the country. But these Bronze Age people gave us three main things. They gave us lactose tolerance, as they drank lots of milk. They were able to tame horses, which was a huge advantage to them. And they also had bronze, which was a big step up from stone, obviously. And we have some other haplogroups that have ended up in Ireland. So there's J2, which is only about 1%, and the E1B. So both of these are North African, Mediterranean haplogroups that most likely have ended up in Ireland because they probably ended up in Britain during the Roman period. But we've found all sorts of strange haplogroups that have arrived in Ireland at different times. So it can't be just put down to that, but that's when most of them probably got here. And then we have the R1A, which is a Viking or a Norman haplogroup, and 2% of Irish men descended from that. Just to give you a quick little idea of how the route the R1B people came from the Russian steppe and ended up in the Caucasus, and they stayed in the Caucasus while the I haplogroup actually moved across and inhabited Ireland once the Ice Age passed. We then had the G haplogroup, which brought the farming methods, and at this stage the R1B guys were starting to get on the move. They were actually what's called the Yamnaya culture, which gave way to the corded ware culture and the bell beakers, which lots of people would have heard of. They're all descended from this R1B. And what we find is that the R1B are particularly dominant along the Atlantic corridor, and they settled all along the Atlantic countries. They're in countries in Central Europe as well, but they're very, very dominant in these countries: Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, Spain, France. And so what I'm going to do now is just run through a few examples that we have of what we discovered using the projects and using the DNA and the histories. And so the first one is obviously my own story about the Costellos of Kilkenny, and when I did my test, I expected that I would have, firstly, hopefully a few Costello matches, and secondly, that some of those matches would be from Galway or Mayo, which is where the Costellos are supposed to have originated. The Costellos are descended from a Norman family, the Anglos who went over with Hugh de Lacy, and there's actually a barony of Costello in East Mayo. So that was what I expected when I did my DNA test, but quickly found was I had Costello here, who was my uncle who also did the test. But after this, I had Casto, C-A-S-T-O, so Casto, another Casto, and then a couple of Costellos, who London surnames. And so I was very perplexed by this. But then this man here, I blanked out the first names, but this man here, the third one on the list, contacted me within 24 hours. And he was greatly relieved to see my DNA results. I did my DNA in 2018, and he and most of the other Castos that were on the list had done their DNA in 2008. And they've been waiting patiently for 10 years for somebody to do a DNA test, and eventually it did. So the Castos, we got together and we started doing a bit of research, and we think we eventually figured out where the whole thing comes together. And so what we found, or what the Casto researchers already knew, was that this area in red here in New Jersey, the Delaware Bay, is where the first Castos in America were found. And they confined him there was a William Casto in about 1710 living in that area, and his neighbours were actually how we call the shepherds. I'm sure many of you are familiar with shepherds locally here in Ireland. There's auctioneers up in Ballynash, and so the Castos were living beside the shepherds, but about 30 years beforehand, in the 1680s, there was a William Costello. He was mentioned in the records a couple of different times, spelled in a variety of different ways, but he was living in the same plot of land beside the shepherds. And so one of the Castle researchers had a fabulous book written on the history of the shepherds, and they had a lot of letters written between the Irish shepherds and the New Jersey shepherds over a couple of hundred years. And so they were able to put together a fabulous history of the shepherds, which one of the main details that came out of it was that the shepherds originally settled in Ireland in this little blue almost triangle down there, almost at the bottom of the screen. That's an area just over the border from Kilkenny into Tipperary, a place called Castle John. And so there was a Thomas Shepherd who was part of the Oliver Cromwell's army in the 1650s. When he came to Ireland, he was given Castle John as his garrison, 27 men there, and eventually he was actually given 1,400 acres around Castle John. And so he settled there with his family. They were Baptists, and so they were out there for a while. And then we found that the large area in Pinkenshred there, around Wine Gap and below, is actually where the largest concentration of Costellos were in the 1850s. So there's a lot of Costello households there. The postman in Wine Gap tells me there isn't a Costello anywhere out that way now, but there was lots of them back in the 1850s. But I would assume before that. And so the story we have pieced together is that it's the shepherds we know left and went to New Jersey in 1683. But at the time, when a family decided they were going to go from the Baptist community, the family themselves didn't go, the whole community went. And so what's very likely is that the William Costello, perhaps his father, was actually had either converted and become a Baptist, or perhaps worked for the shepherds. And when the shepherds left in 1683, this Costello, or his father, left and immigrated to the New World to escape the oncoming persecution of anyone who wasn't Church of Ireland. And so my own ancestor can be traced back to the city of Skull Crossbones, where he's buried. This is a cemetery in Kilcasey, just outside Hubbanston, and he died in 1798, but was born in 1713. So he's not a million miles away from that large group in Windgap. There's also another group of Costellos in this area here called Catstown, again just outside Hubbanston, up to probably about the last 50 years. So it's likely that all these three groups are trying to find actually some descendants of these Catstown Costellos to test. And so we know that the Windgap and the Casey Costellos were related, so the question is are certain Costellos as well. So it's like we're looking for some Costellos descended from them. And so with that, we were able to put together this tree. So this is my line here. This is myself and my uncle, my dad and my grandfather, and it goes all the way back to Mike Pierce Costello. This then is the Costello guys who've done their DNA testing, these 4 lines here. And so that comes back to their ancestors back in New Jersey. And what we've basically found is that the time that the Castors and my branch of Costello split apart was most likely not that long before they actually went to America, probably sometime between 1600 to 1650. There is the other matches I have are these Costellos as well. So these 2 lines are the Costellos, and we need to test a bit more deeply. But in the Money Heart rolls, we find that there's actually no Costellos in Kilkenny, but there are actually many Costelles. So it's possible that these Costelles were also early immigrants and actually kept the more original version of the name. Like I said, I don't have any connection to the Costellos from the west of Ireland, so this is quite surprising, but we've actually recently actually identified the group of Costellos from the west of Ireland, and they're actually they have this I1 haplogroup, which is Norman Viking haplogroup. So sorry, just one last thing on this. I just recently actually tested 2 Costellos who have deep roots in Kilkenny, but I didn't know whether they had any connection to our own Costellos. So one of them was from the Walls Loch Costellos, and they have no connection to ourselves for many thousands of years. So how the 2 groups ended up with the Costello surname is going to be a hard one to untangle. And then we have an even more unusual one, which is a Costello from around Freshford, and he did his DNA, and he was actually the E1B group, which was that North African group. So we now have 3 different groups of Costellos in Kilkenny that one would assume are likely all related if we went back far enough. But the E1B group and my own ancestors would have been common ancestors for 60,000 years. So it's going to be, I just literally got those results last week, so it's going to be a lot of fun trying to tease out how those 3 lines all ended up with the Costellos. So I'll move on to the second example, and this example is actually directly from the Kilkenny Surname Project itself. And the Costellos and the Costellos, some of them are actually in the Kilkenny Surname Project too, but most of that research was done through the Costello Project. the Kilkenny surname project, there's also individual surname projects for the Fitzpatricks and Brennans and Costigans, but the Kings of Ossory work we're doing really in just the Kilkenny surname project. And so if we look at the lineages created by Sherman and Carrigan and all the rest, what we find is that there should be 5 surnames associated with the lineage of the Kings of Ossory. Now this is actually an incredibly small number. The Dalcosh have over 20 or 30 surnames. So it's a very small number of surnames that are supposed to be related or descended from this line. But that's all we have with the annals and the lineages, so that's what we can work with. The first surname is Carroll, which is obviously descended from Carew, who was the greatest king of Ossory. He lived in the 9th century. But Carew had a couple of sons, one of whom was Brannan. Brannan gave rise to the surname the Old Brennán, and then became the Brennans. We then had a few generations after Carew and Brannan. We had Gillapodrick, the Mock Gillapodricks, who in time became the Fitzpatricks after they were forced to convert to Protestantism and become part of the establishment by Henry VIII in 1541. So we had Greenough, Mock Gillapodrick became Barnaby Fitzpatrick, the first Baron of Upper Ossory. And so that's supposedly how the Fitzpatrick surname came about. But in between that, there's 2 other surnames that are supposed to have risen from this line, which were the O'Donohues, or apparently more commonly in Kilkenny, they're Dunphys. In Kilkenny we have far more Dunphys than we have Donohues. And then we also have Costigan, which is definitely supposed to be from this lineage. I suppose the thing to note here is the order in which they branch apart. So we have one line that the Brennans branch off, and then Costigan should branch off below the Brennans. And when we looked at the Kilkenny surname project, there was one group that really stood out, and it's a haplogroup called A1487. We don't need to remember that, but that's what it is. It's part of this R1b, so it's actually known as A1487. And what we find is that haplogroup comes down along here, branches off, we get the Brennans, and then branches off the Gillapodricks, and then becomes Fitzpatricks on 2 sides and Costigan down the middle. So this is, in essence, it's the right branching structure that we would expect. The dates here are a little off, but dating with Y-DNA is almost an art rather than a real science, because I won't go into the specifics of it. I'd be here all night, but we, having looked at this again, we actually think that these dates are likely actually quite a bit older. So it's probably going to fit in quite well. But this gives us a good idea. And so if we look at all the testers who have tested and they come in as this A1487 or below it on the branches, we find that 49% of them have the Fitzpatrick surname, 15.5% have the Brennan surname, 8% Fitzgerald, 5% Dalton, and basically 1 or 2 each of the following surnames, including Costigan. And I suppose what this shows is that there's a huge domination of the Fitzpatrick, Brennan, and Costigan surname in this group. And in fact, would be if we just look solely at the Fitzpatricks or the Brennans or the Costigans, there is no other group that actually has all 3 surnames in it. Obviously, we need to figure out how these 2 normal names get involved, but again, they're relatively low levels, and it's a bit more work. The other thing we look at then is where these testers say their most distant known ancestor is from. And so we look at all the testers below this A1487. We find that 27% say that their ancestors are from Kilkenny, 7% from Laois, 10% different Tipperary. When the Ocular Padraigs were driven out of Kilkenny by the Normans, they supposedly went up to what's known as Upper Ossory now. It's the Slieve Blue Mountains, which border Tipperary, so that would explain this 10% of Tipperary. And just modern movement, Tipperary isn't that far from Kilkenny village. 20% of them only knew that their ancestors were from Ireland, 5% South England, 5% South USA, and 27% either didn't know or didn't do the data. But even still, this is quite a strong signal to say that lots of these people are actually from the area that's typical for the Kings of Ulster. And so, while it's not conclusive, it's very, very likely. And the thing is, the more people test, the more we'll know. We're working with about 40 samples of people under A1 to 87. The Dalcosh, when they did their paper, were working with about 120. So they have far more samples than we had. And they had far more since then. So their results have only got stronger. And we, as in those of us in the Kilkenny Surname projects who are working on this, would hope that more testers with the surnames will show that the signal will only get stronger. The last example I'll run through again is from the Kilkenny Surname project, and it's the grants and the powers. So the grant and power surnames are both supposed to be Norman surnames, and they're supposed to have come over with the innovation not long after Strongbow. And so the thing is, when I did my grant, I had some grant relations that I got tested, and I thought the wouldn't help it being just lots of grants in their matches. But what I quickly found was when my first grant tester was Father Percy Grant, who passed away last year, and Father Percy Grant's DNA matches were 15% grants but 51% power. So this is a huge number, and all the other surnames are very small, so it's a very strong signaling. And when I looked at the dating between the grants and powers of that early period using the low level testing we had worked on, and it looked like the connection was about 400 to 500 years old. So that was are my grants really powers, or are my powers really grants? Was there a surname or DNA switch somewhere along the line? Was there an adoption and fidelity? Changing surname for whatever reason. And so actually one of the people that's on the talk here, Noel, we did a higher level test with Noel where we could figure out the exact haplogroup that Noel has. And when we did that and we dated it against the powers who did the same sort of test, what we found was actually the dating was far older. The date was about 900 years old of the last time grants and power shared a common ancestor. And so what that really shows us is that they were actually brothers or cousins. So probably by the time the Norman invasion, they were maybe second or third cousins by the time they got here. And I suppose the interesting thing is that they both ended up in the same part of the country. So they both ended up in South Kilkenny. Obviously, the powers ended up a lot in Waterford as well. They had a lot of territory just west of Waterford City. But those little blue dots in South Kilkenny there are actually some castles associated with grants. That was a poor theory that the grants were actually the barons of Iverk, but it's been easily disproved. But the thing is that when the first barons of Iverk were actually the Fitzgeralds, Gael, were forced to give the land to the Butlers. What we find is that in the Ormond deeds that the witnesses for that transaction, two of the witnesses were actually Grant and Power. They were signed just beside each other. But that doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot that side beside each other, but now the fact that we see that they're actually related to each other is huge. And actually, the signature after the grant and power was actually this surname here, Archdeacon, which we all know as Cody. And so, what we'd really love is if we actually had some Codys from South Kilkenny, or if there's any Archdeacons out there to do a test. It would be very interesting to see if that Archdeacon is just an outlier, or if actually the Archdeacon Grant and Codys are actually all related. And once we have the Ossory, King's Ossory part of the project done, our next step would actually be to start looking at some of the Norman families, obviously the Butlers, and look at there's many other Norman families that are associated with Kilkenny. I suppose another thing to note about Kilkenny is that Kilkenny actually has some fairly unique surnames that are, if you look at surname distribution maps, that you date back to the 1850s or the early 1900s. Those surnames are only found in Kilkenny, like sort of after it's only found in Kilkenny. Dohney, Delahunty, predominantly Kilkenny. So there's some really interesting surnames there that we can go after and try and figure out, are the Delahuntys related to Kings of Ossory today, or are they related to the Norman invaders, or where did these surnames come from, who else are they related to, and then try and get a greater interest, or greater understanding of where they came from. The grants and the powers, however, like I said, they're actually this I1 haplogroup, which is a Scandinavian haplogroup. And when I looked at the last two names on this list here, we see there's Foss and Strogan, probably pronounced that wrong, but they're German surnames. And when we looked at where those German men gave their ancestors, where they said their ancestors were from, they said they were from this area in Mecklenburg, which is, as you can see, in northern Germany on the Baltic coast, and their ancestors actually come from this part of Mecklenburg, and it's not beyond the bounds of possibility to imagine that this part of Germany was probably quite Danish or Viking, shall we call it, or whatever you want to ascribe it to, back in the Viking era. And so it's not beyond the bounds of possibility to imagine that a man or a couple of brothers possibly made their way to Normandy and thereafter to Ireland, or maybe made their way to the Danelaw in England and settled there, and then eventually part of the Norman invasion. But that's the kind of things that we're able to uncover with the surname projects. So just in conclusion, obviously, when researching your surname and historical context, times dealing with the Y2A can really help you gain a lot more insights into family's origins. As I said before, we've got more testers from Kilkenny and Ireland, and the thing is, a lot of the current testers are actually part of the diaspora, and while they're very interested to know where they're from, without actually people from Ireland testing, because a lot of what they're giving us is only guessing. So actually, the more people we have that have deep roots in Kilkenny or Ireland or whatever, they're actually they'll be a lot more used to tying the diaspora. And when you do a test, you should join as many projects as are relevant to it. And about 10 or 15 projects just with my own DNA. So there's no harm being involved in lots of different projects, and there are lots of different things to do in different projects. So that's it. Any questions? Sure.